All right, diving right in. You sent us this research paper, Hand Knowledge Generation Approach 2021.pdf. Quite a mouthful.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tense one.
It is, but it's fascinating stuff. It's all about this thing called the Science Rating Heuristic, SWH for short, and it's basically a different way of approaching how we learn science.
Right, you were particularly interested in the fact that this paper is a systematic review. So it's not just one study, it's actually a compilation of findings from 81 different masters and doctoral theses. That's a lot of research all in one place.
It's a huge amount of data, yeah. And that's exactly why we wanted to do this deep dive, to really unpack it. Does this SWH thing actually help students learn better? And what can we learn from it, not just for educators, but for anyone who's interested in learning more effectively? I think that's something a lot of us are always striving for, right?
Absolutely. And I think what makes this so interesting is the way it approaches learning. This knowledge generation approach, as it's called, focuses on the process, like the steps involved in learning, rather than just the end product. Like, it's not just about what you know, but how you got there.
Right. It's kind of like, okay, you built this amazing Lego castle, but what were the steps you took? What did you learn along the way?
Exactly. It's about understanding the construction process, the thinking, the problem solving, the decisions you made to get to that final product.
And for someone like you, I mean, you're all about diving deep into topics and really understanding them, but sometimes it can feel overwhelming, right? Like there's just so much information out there. So I feel like this idea of understanding how knowledge is built, how we actually learn things is really powerful. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is generative learning, which is what this SWH approach is based on?
Well, at its heart, generative learning is about actively connecting new information to what you already know, like building on a foundation you already have.
Okay, so it's not just about taking in new facts. It's about making those facts meaningful to you.
Exactly. One of the key researchers in this area, a guy named Whitrock, he described it as creating semantic and distinctive idiosyncratic associations.
Okay, that sounds pretty complicated.
It does, but basically it just means making personal connections to new ideas. Like, how does this new piece of information fit into what I already understand? Does it challenge my existing beliefs? Does it confirm them? How can I make sense of this in my own way?
So it's about taking ownership of the information, making it your own.
Exactly. And Lee and a few other researchers back in 2008, they made the point that this self-driven process, this making connections on your own, is super important for really understanding something. You know, you can hear something, you can read something, but to truly learn it, you need to actively make it your own.
It's like that aha moment, right? When suddenly something clicks and it makes sense because you found a way to connect it to what you already know.
Right. It's about integrating that new information into your existing knowledge network.
So how do we actually do this effectively? What are some strategies that can help us with this generative learning process?
Well, Furella and his team, they've done a ton of work on this, and they suggest that effective learning strategies are ones that help you organize new ideas, integrate them into your long-term memory, and then apply them in different situations.
Makes sense. So it's not just about memorizing, it's about being able to actually use what you've learned.
Exactly. And they've identified 8 key strategies: mapping, drawing, imagining, summarizing, self-explaining, teaching, self-testing, and enacting.
Okay, that's a pretty comprehensive list. And I can see how each of those goes beyond just passively reading or listening to something.
Absolutely. They each involve actively working with the information in different ways. And one interesting distinction they make is between how we represent our understanding internally and externally.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So strategies like mapping, drawing, and imagining, these are more internal. You're essentially creating representations inside your own head, kind of translating the information into a form that makes sense to you. You might use mental images or diagrams or flowcharts to organize and connect ideas. For instance, if you're trying to learn about the human circulatory system, you might picture the heart pumping blood through the arteries and veins, kind of like a network of roads.
Right, so you're creating your own internal model of how it works.
Exactly. Now, the other 5 strategies, summarizing, self-explaining, teaching, self-testing, and enacting these, are more about demonstrating your understanding externally.
So it's about taking those internal representations and expressing them in a way that others can see and understand.
Precisely. And Whitrock, who we mentioned earlier, he actually argued that these external strategies often require more mental effort because you have to articulate and justify your thinking to someone else. You can't just have a vague idea in your head. You have to be able to explain it clearly and convincingly.
It's like when you have to teach something to someone else. You realize how much you actually know or don't know when you try to explain it.
Exactly. And that's the power of these external strategies. They force you to engage with the information on a deeper level.
So the paper mentioned that in science classrooms, these strategies don't usually work alone. It's more about using them together.
Yeah, that's a key point. Fiorella and Mayer suggest we should think of these as a strategy cluster. In a real classroom setting, these strategies often overlap and support each other. It's not about finding the one best strategy, but about how they work together to help students learn.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork with generative learning. Now let's talk about the star of the show, the science writing heuristic, SWH. How does it fit into this whole picture of generative learning in science?
So the SWH was developed by Keyes and her colleagues back in 1999. And it was specifically designed to get students actively involved in these generative learning processes in science. It places a lot of emphasis on the role of argumentation and using scientific language, not just memorizing facts, but actually thinking and communicating like a scientist.
So even though it has writing in the name, it's about more than just putting words on paper.
Exactly. It's really about the thinking processes involved in constructing scientific knowledge. Writing is a big part of it, but it's more of a tool, a way for students to make their thinking visible and to refine their understanding.
Okay, so it's not just about writing a lab report after you've done an experiment.
Right. It's more of an ongoing process throughout a science unit. Students are constantly using their existing knowledge, asking questions, gathering evidence, developing arguments, and then revising their understanding based on what they've learned. And this process happens in different ways individually, in small groups, and as a whole class.
So it's about creating a dynamic learning environment where students are constantly engaging with the ideas and with each other.
Precisely. And it's worth noting that this aligns with how scientists actually work. They don't just sit alone in a lab and come up with answers. They're constantly collaborating, debating, presenting their findings, and revising their theories based on new evidence.
So this idea of SWH as a disciplinary generative approach, as Moji called it, it's about reflecting the way scientists actually think and work.
Exactly. It's about embedding the learning process within the discipline of science itself, not just treating it as a separate set of skills.
So walk me through the steps. How does the SWH actually work in practice?
Well, the paper outlines three main phases. The first phase is all about understanding the epistemic demands.
Epistemic demands. That sounds a little intimidating.
It does sound a bit jargony. But basically, it means figuring out what it means to do science. What are the rules of the game? How do we ask questions, gather evidence, and build arguments in a scientific way? How do we use scientific language effectively? So in this first phase, students might start by brainstorming what they already know about a topic. They might create concept maps to visualize their understanding, or draw diagrams to represent their ideas. Or they might even use their imaginations to picture a process or phenomenon.
So it's about getting their initial thoughts and ideas out there, starting to grapple with the concepts.
Right. It's about activating their prior knowledge and getting them ready to engage with the new information.
Okay, so what happens next?
The second phase is the argument phase. This is where things really start to heat up. Now the focus is on developing arguments and persuading others of your ideas. Students start by formulating specific questions they want to investigate. Then they design their own experiments or investigations, gather data, and analyze the results. The goal is to use that data as evidence to support their claims. They're essentially putting their ideas to the test and seeing if they hold up.
So it's like being a detective, right? Gathering clues and building a case.
Exactly. And they're not just doing this in isolation. They're constantly discussing their ideas with their peers, debating different interpretations, and refining their arguments based on feedback and new evidence. And of course, writing plays a big role here. They're documenting their findings, presenting their arguments in a clear and logical way, and revising their thinking as they go. The paper also mentions the importance of argument structure, making sure they're moving from their initial question or premise to a conclusion supported by solid evidence and reasoning.
So they're learning not just what to think, but how to think like a scientist.
Absolutely. And the last phase is the summary writing phase. Now that they've gone through all this investigation and argumentation, the goal is to synthesize what they've learned and communicate it clearly to others. They need to be able to explain the big idea, the key takeaway from the unit, drawing on all the different sources of information they've encountered, their own findings, the textbook, class discussions, expert opinions, and presenting it in a way that makes sense to someone who wasn't part of the whole process.
So it's like writing the final report, but for a wider audience.
Right. And this involves a lot of higher level thinking skills. They need to select the most important information, organize it in a logical way, connect the different pieces together, and use language that's clear and concise. The paper emphasizes that summary writing is actually quite different from argument writing. With argument, you're trying to persuade someone of a particular viewpoint. With summary, you're trying to present a balanced and objective overview of what's been learned.
So it's like stepping back and looking at the big picture, pulling it all together.
Exactly. And this act of summarizing, of having to explain what you've learned to someone else, really helps solidify the understanding in your own mind.
Okay, so this SWH approach sounds really interesting in theory, but does it actually work? This review looked at 81 theses, so there must be a lot of data on how it actually affects student learning.
Yes, there is. And the overall finding is a resounding yes. Students who learn through the SWH approach, regardless of their grade level or their cultural background, consistently showed significant improvements in a few key areas: understanding science concepts, developing critical thinking skills, and being able to use different ways to represent information, like charts and graphs.
That's really encouraging. So let's break that down a bit, starting with understanding science concepts. How did they actually measure that, and what did the research show?
Well, they measured conceptual understanding in a couple of different ways. Some studies use more general assessments, like standardized tests. Others use assessments created by the teachers themselves, which were more specifically focused on the content being taught in the unit. Looking across the studies, the broader standardized tests, particularly in the US and in Turkey, showed small to medium positive effects for the SWH approach. Interestingly, one math study in the US actually found even larger positive effects. And when you look at the more specific teacher-created tests, those showed a range of positive effects, from small to large, in the US, Turkey, and Korea.
Okay, so there's definitely a positive impact there, but why do you think there's such a range of effects? Like, why did some studies show bigger improvements than others?
There are probably a few reasons for that. One might be the way they measured learning. Standardized tests are designed to be very general, so they might not capture the specific nuances of what students learned through the SWH approach. Teacher-created tests, on the other hand, are often more closely aligned with the specific concepts and skills being taught, so they might be more sensitive to the changes in student understanding.
Makes sense. And I guess the context also matters. Like, what grade level were the students? What was the specific science topic? How experienced was the teacher? All of those things could play a role.
Absolutely. All those factors can interact in complex ways, but perhaps one of the most encouraging findings related to conceptual understanding was that the SWH approach often helped to close the achievement gap between different groups of students.
Like between boys and girls, or between high-achieving and low-achieving students.
Exactly. And there were some really compelling examples of this. There was a study by Hohenschel in 2004 with 10th grade biology students, and she found that while boys initially did better on the tests, that difference completely disappeared over the 6 weeks they used the SWH. By the third exam, there was no significant difference between boys and girls.
Wow, that's a big deal.
It is. And there's a similar study by Pook in 2005 in a college chemistry class. Again, men initially scored higher on a standardized chemistry test, but after they implemented the SWH approach, that gap disappeared. And Mohammed, in a 2007 college chemistry study, found the same thing. So it really suggests that the SWH approach can level the playing field and give all students a better chance to succeed.
That's incredibly promising. Okay, so we've talked about conceptual understanding. What about critical thinking and those science process skills? Did the SWH have an impact there?
Yes, it did. A number of studies found that the SWH approach helps students develop those skills as well. For example, there's research by Hand and colleagues in 2018, Stevenson in 2015, Ulu in 2011, and Park in 2012.
Oh.
All of these studies indicated that the SWH fostered the development of critical thinking and science process skills.
And was there anything particularly interesting about any of those findings?
Yeah, actually, there was a study by Ulu in 2011 conducted in Turkey that found really large positive effects on both science process skills and students' ability to reflect on their own learning, which is called metacognition.
So not only are they getting better at doing science, but they're also becoming more aware of how they learn.
Exactly. Which is really important for becoming a lifelong learner. And of course, writing is a key part of the SWH approach. What did the research say about how that affected students' ability to summarize what they learned? Well, there were 5 studies conducted in Korea that looked specifically at how SWH influenced learning through summary writing. They looked at things like understanding the main ideas, conceptual understanding of the science content, how well students used arguments in their writing, and their overall writing skills.
So a pretty comprehensive look at summary writing. And what did they find?
The consistent finding across all 5 studies was that the SWH approach was very effective in improving learning through those summary writing tasks.
So the act of writing those summaries, of having to put what they've learned into their own words, really helped them solidify their understanding.
Exactly. It's like the process of writing forces you to clarify your thinking and make connections between different ideas. One study by Moon in 2011, for example, showed really significant positive effects in all of those areas. The main ideas, conceptual understanding, argumentation, and writing skills.
Very cool. And lastly, what about those representational skills, the ability to use charts, graphs, diagrams, all those visual ways of representing information?
This is another area where the research showed really promising results. There were 3 studies that specifically looked at representational skills. McDermott's 2009 study, for instance, found that students in the SWH classes were significantly better than students in traditional classes at combining different ways of representing information in their writing, like incorporating graphs and diagrams along with their written explanations. They also found that the ability to do this well was linked to better understanding of the science concepts. Another study by Keels in 2016 looked at students from 4th to 8th grade, and they found that the SWH approach led to improvements in different aspects of how students use representations in their writing.
So they were able to use those visual tools more effectively to communicate their understanding.
Exactly. And there's one more study worth mentioning, a longitudinal study by Neal in 2017. This one followed kindergarten students for 3 years, and they found significant improvement in representational skills over that time period.
That's really interesting. So starting with the SWH approach early on can have long-term benefits.
Yeah, exactly. And it also suggests that it might take some time, maybe 18 to 24 months, for those skills to really blossom. It's not an instant transformation.
Right. It's about building those skills and habits of mind over time. Okay, so it seems pretty clear that this SWH approach has a positive impact on student learning in a lot of different ways. But the paper also looked at what makes that impact even stronger. What factors seem to be key in maximizing student learning with the SWH?
There are a few key factors that emerged from the research. One of the most important is the level of implementation by the teachers. 6 different studies found a strong connection between teachers who used the SWH approach more effectively and higher levels of student achievement.
So it's not just about using the SWH, it's about using it well.
Precisely. A great tool is only as good as the person using it. There was a 3-year study by Gwinnell, for example, that showed a really strong correlation between how well teachers implemented the SWH and their students' scores on standardized tests. And Akus, in a 2007 math study, found that those achievement gaps we talked about earlier between high-achieving and low-achieving students, well, those disappeared in classrooms where the SWH was implemented at a high level.
That's powerful stuff. So teacher quality really matters.
It absolutely does. And this goes beyond just knowing the steps of the SWH approach. It's about really understanding the underlying principles, being able to adapt it to different contexts, and creating that supportive and challenging classroom environment where students can really thrive.
Okay, so what else is important?
Time is another critical factor, both time for teachers to learn the SWH approach and time for students to get comfortable with it. Cavagnetto, in a year-long study, found that the amount of time spent using the SWH, as well as the interaction between the teacher and that time, all had a big impact on how well students learned.
So it's not a quick fix. It takes time for both teachers and students to really get on board with this new way of learning.
Exactly. And that's reflected in a few other studies as well. Neal's 2017 study, for example, found that teachers who had been using the SWH for more than 18 months, their students produced higher quality writing. And then there was a 10-year study by Chanlin, a really impressive long-term study, that showed that students who started learning with SWH in kindergarten had better overall science achievement over the long haul compared to those who started later.
Wow, 10 years. That's a big commitment. But it clearly shows the long-term benefits of starting early and sticking with it.
Exactly. And that consistency seems to be key. In fact, the paper even suggests that some studies that didn't find strong positive results might have been too short. Like Arnold's 2011 study, which only lasted 15 days, didn't show significant improvements.
Makes sense. It's like anything worthwhile, it takes time and effort to see the real results. Now, what about the students' own work? Did the quality of their work have an impact on their learning?
Definitely. 4 studies found a really interesting link between the quality of student writing things, like how well they used evidence to support their claims, how clearly they explained the connection between their claims and the evidence, and how effectively they used different ways of representing information. All of that was linked to how well they understood the concepts.
So the better they were at writing, the better they were at understanding the science.
It seems that way. Choi's 2008 study, for example, looked at chemistry lab reports and found that higher quality writing was associated with a deeper grasp of the chemistry concepts. And McDermott, in their 2009 work on atomic structure, found a similar link. The 2016 study by Kiels also highlighted how important those representational skills are. When students can use visuals effectively in their writing, it helps them explain their reasoning more clearly, and that leads to better understanding.
So it's not just about writing a lot, it's about writing well.
Exactly. It's about using writing as a tool for thinking, for making connections, for building arguments, and for clarifying your understanding.
Okay. And the last factor mentioned in the paper was about using a reading framework. What's that all about?
This was particularly interesting. It came from a cluster of studies conducted in Korea, and they found that using a structured approach to reading within the SWH framework could further improve students' conceptual understanding and their critical thinking skills. A 2011 study by Jang, for example, found that students who used such a framework did better on those summary writing tasks, suggesting that it gave them a structure for pulling out the key ideas and connecting them to what they already knew. And a few other studies by Jang, Sung in 2013, and Park in 2012 all found that combining SWH with this structured reading approach was particularly effective in boosting critical thinking.
So it's not just about doing the SWH activities, it's also about being strategic in how you approach the reading material.
Precisely. It's about giving students the tools they need to effectively extract meaning from what they read and integrate that knowledge into their own understanding.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, looking at those quantitative findings, the numbers. But the paper also looked at the qualitative side, like how this knowledge generation actually plays out in SWH classrooms. What did those findings reveal about the processes at work?
Yes, those qualitative findings were really illuminating. They gave us a much deeper understanding of what's actually happening in those classrooms, how students are interacting, how teachers are guiding the process, and how all of that contributes to the knowledge generation.
I'm curious to hear more about that. Where should we start?
Well, let's start with language, because both talking and writing play a huge role in the SWH approach.
Makes sense. So what did the research say about how the way students talk and write helps them learn in these SWH classrooms?
One study by Ahmadi Basir back in 2011 used something called discourse analysis to look closely at the language students used in class discussions. And they found that over time, as students became more familiar with the SWH approach, they started using more sophisticated scientific language. They would start with more everyday language, but then through those discussions and encountering new scientific terms, they gradually incorporated those terms into their own language, using them more accurately and confidently.
So they were learning not just the science concepts, but also the language of science.
Exactly. And that's really important for being able to communicate effectively in the scientific community. And there's another study by Venus, also from 2011, that looked at different patterns of teacher talk in SWH classrooms. And they found that the most effective teachers spent a lot of time talking through ideas with their students.
What does talking through look like?
It's about really engaging with students' ideas, asking clarifying questions, building on their contributions, and using those contributions to co-construct a shared understanding. It's not just about the teacher delivering information. It's about creating a space for dialogue and exploration.
Okay, so it's about the teacher being a facilitator, a guide, rather than just a lecturer.
Exactly. Now, what about writing? What role does that play in knowledge generation?
Well, Honshell's research, a 2004 study in the U.S., found that it was really important to provide students with support in their writing and to help them think about who their audience was. They found that when students had to write for a younger audience, for example, it forced them to break down complex ideas into simpler terms, which actually helped them understand the concepts better themselves.
Interesting. So having to explain something simply really forces you to think it through more carefully. Exactly. And then there were a couple of studies by Cavagnetto in 2006 and Chen in 2011 that looked at how talking and writing work together in SWH classrooms. They found that as students gained more experience with the approach, they increasingly used those two modes together, moving seamlessly between talking and writing as they tried to make sense of ideas. Cavagnetto even suggested that the kind of talk that happens while students are also writing, that simultaneous engagement with both modes, might actually lead to stronger arguments. And Chen's research showed that this combined use of talk and writing was linked to the development of more sophisticated thinking skills, those higher-level cognitive functions that we talked about earlier.
It makes sense, right? Like talking is great for brainstorming and bouncing ideas off each other, and then writing helps you organize those thoughts and solidify your understanding.
Exactly. It's about using both tools strategically to support the learning process.
So we've talked about language, both talking and writing. What about argumentation? We know that's a key part of the SWH approach. How does engaging in argument help students generate knowledge?
Well, there are several studies that look specifically at how the use of argument in SWH classrooms contributes to learning. Martin, for example, did a 2-year study in a 5th-grade classroom, and she documented how the teacher gradually shifted her focus to really emphasize claims and evidence in class discussions. Over time, the students became more adept at evaluating claims, looking for the supporting evidence, and judging the strength of arguments. And studies by Diaz in 2011 and Promiot in 2013, they also observed teachers increasingly incorporating elements of argument into their interactions with students, encouraging them to explain their reasoning and back up their claims with evidence. Venus, in their 2011 study, also noted that focus on evaluating claims and evidence in the SWH classroom.
So it's about moving beyond just stating opinions and getting into the habit of backing up those opinions with evidence and logical reasoning.
Precisely. And these studies also found that the quality of students' writing improved when they were using argument to explain their ideas. Rudd's 2001 study, for instance, found that students actually preferred using the SWH format for lab reports because it helped them understand the importance of evidence in scientific writing. And Chen's 2011 research showed a clear progression in the quality of student writing as they incorporated more elements of argument. Yoon, in a 2012 study, also highlighted how writing helps students develop and demonstrate their reasoning skills. So it's not just about being able to write a good argument, it's about the thinking processes that go into constructing that argument.
It makes sense. When you have to build an argument, you have to really think critically about the evidence, consider different perspectives, and anticipate counterarguments. That's a lot of mental work, and it clearly strengthens your understanding.
Exactly. It's about engaging with ideas on a deeper level. And the last aspect of knowledge generation mentioned in the paper was about creating dialogical environments.
Right.
What does that actually look like in an SWH classroom? Well, this is all about the quality of the interactions that happen in the classroom. And one key finding that emerged was the importance of the kinds of questions teachers ask. A 2004 study by Omar, for example, looked at different teachers using SWH and found a clear distinction between those who were implementing it effectively and those who weren't. The teachers who weren't implementing it as effectively tended to rely more on those simple recall questions like, what is the definition of photosynthesis? Or what are the 3 states of matter?
Right, those kinds of questions that just test your memory, not your understanding.
Exactly. And they tended to follow a more traditional teacher-centered pattern of interaction. The teacher asks the question, the student responds, the teacher evaluates the answer, and so on. But the teachers who were implementing the SWH approach more effectively, they used more open-ended questions. Questions that encourage students to think more deeply, to make connections, to explain their reasoning, and to engage in meaningful discussions.
So questions like, why do you think that? Or what evidence do you have to support that claim?
Exactly. And those questions really shifted the dynamic in the classroom, creating a space for genuine dialogue and exploration. They also focused more on guiding students toward those big ideas, those overarching concepts, rather than getting bogged down in specific facts and details.
And were there any other studies that looked at this aspect of dialogical environments?
Yeah, Promide's 2013 research in Thailand found a similar pattern. The more effective teachers used those open-ended questions, and they also encouraged students to take ownership of the discussions, working in groups and leading those conversations themselves. And Kim's 2015 study provided even more evidence for this. He found that teachers who asked higher-level questions, those thought-provoking questions that we talked about, their students gave more complex answers and demonstrated deeper levels of understanding. And interestingly, the teachers themselves talked less, giving students more space to grapple with the ideas and negotiate meaning together. This really aligns with Venus's finding that effective teachers use students' ideas as valuable resources for learning. It's not just about the teacher imparting knowledge, it's about creating a collaborative learning environment where everyone's contributions are valued.
So it's about shifting from that traditional model of the teacher as the sole source of knowledge to a more collaborative model where knowledge is co-constructed through dialogue and interaction.
Exactly. It's about empowering students to be active participants in the learning process. And that brings us to the last section of the paper, which focused on teacher change necessary for knowledge generation environments. What did they find about the role of the teacher in creating these kinds of environments? Well, this is a really important part of the findings. 13 of the 81 theses actually provided specific evidence on how teachers influence the learning process with the SWH. And as we've already touched on, 6 of those studies really highlighted how crucial the teacher's skill level is in implementing the SWH approach effectively.
We talked about that earlier, right? The importance of teacher quality.
Exactly. Goodall's 3-year study, for example, is a great illustration of this. As teachers gained more experience and became more skilled in using the SWH, their students' achievement also improved. And Martin's 2008 study documented how one teacher, over the course of 18 months, gradually shifted from a more traditional teacher-centered approach to a more student-centered one as she became more comfortable with the SWH. But it's not just about the technical skills of implementing the approach. 4 studies actually emphasized that teachers' underlying beliefs about how students learn are absolutely crucial for successful and sustainable implementation of the SWH.
So their mindset matters just as much as their skill set.
Exactly. Williams, in a 2007 study, found that teachers' beliefs about teaching and learning had a big influence on how effectively they implemented inquiry-based teaching, which is a core element of the SWH. And Martin's case study that we just mentioned that also showed a clear shift in the teacher's beliefs over those 18 months. As she moved away from that traditional view of the teacher as the dispenser of knowledge and embraced a more constructivist view, where students actively build their own understanding, that's when her teaching practices really started to change, and her students benefited as a result. And Su, in a 2016 study, reaches a similar conclusion. He found that teachers' beliefs about learning are absolutely central to their ability to fully embrace a knowledge generation approach like the SWH.
So it's not just about learning a new set of techniques. It's about really rethinking your whole approach to teaching and learning.
Exactly. And this isn't something that happens overnight. It takes time, ongoing professional development, and a deep engagement with the principles behind the SWH.
It sounds like it's a journey, not a destination.
Definitely. And it's a journey that requires a lot of reflection, experimentation, and collaboration with colleagues.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive into the science writing heuristic. To bring it all together, what would you say are the main takeaways from this review of 81 theses?
I'd say the main conclusion is that the science writing heuristic, as a prime example of a knowledge generation approach, really does have a significant positive impact on how students learn science. We see this across multiple studies, across different grade levels, and across different cultural contexts.
And the benefits go beyond just knowing the facts.
Absolutely. We see improvements in conceptual understanding, critical thinking skills, those science process skills, representational skills, and communication skills. And perhaps most importantly, the SWH approach has the potential to create more equitable learning environments where all students have the opportunity to succeed.
And what are the key ingredients that make this approach so effective?
Well, the emphasis on argumentation is central. That process of constructing arguments, supporting claims with evidence, and considering different perspectives, that's really at the heart of it. And of course, both talking and writing play vital roles in that process. The way the SWH moves between individual work, small group discussions, and whole class interactions, that also seems to